So I am going to go ahead and make an assumption about everyone in this room. You're lovers of fiction, or maybe you just needed a place to sit. There's no judgment either way. For those of you who are readers, though, we do all know that every story has its own origins, whether the story be original or more or less belong to another. The Fault in Our Stars, which is my actual favorite book ever, is inspired by the true story of a Make-A-Wish girl, Esther Earle, who used her wish to meet author John Green. He wrote the book. Veronica Roth grew up in the suburbs of Chicago, and as she drove past the Sears Tower basically every day, which she would later call the Hub, she would wonder if there was a way somebody would jump from the top of the tower and still hope to survive. It was this in combination with her college psychology classes that created The Dauntless and her trilogy Divergent. Suzanne Collins came up with the Hunger Games because she was channel surfing in her TV in bed one night. She went from a reality show featuring teenagers to real-time footage of war in Iraq. As tired as she was in bed that night, the lines of the two channels blurred for her, and Katniss Everdeen was born. And then I'm sure many of you know Stephenie Meyer wrote her Twilight series based on a dream, but also one of those bands whose name I cannot currently remember. Dreams are probably one of the more common inspiration for stories, but another really common inspiration for stories is other stories. Any book can be picked up, and inside could be found fairy tales, Wonderland, Middle-earth, Shakespeare, Jane Austen. I could go on. And then one could pick up a book and find a story that's been read before because it was once a fan fiction of somebody else's story. And that's the topic that we're referring to today. I'm going to make another assumption about the readers in this room. We all probably know what fan fiction is. Otherwise, we wouldn't be here.
Right.
This is Comic-Con. I mean, come on. On the tiny chance that we don't all know what fan fiction is fiction written by the fans. There's an author, Dennis L. McKiernan. He published most of his books throughout the 80s and the 90s. He wanted a direct sequel to Lord of the Rings. As he wasn't the IP owner of Lord of the Rings, he had to create his own IP, his own world, basically. And that's how his Iron Tower trilogy came to be. C.S. Lewis is the creator of one of the most well-known and loved worlds, Narnia. He didn't consider it until after he was writing the story that Chronicles of Narnia is more or less a biblical allegory. And then there are dozens, maybe even hundreds of books and movies that fictionally fill in the gaps of Jane Austen's life. She recently would have been 250, by the way. The readers and the writers have not really known much about her personal life because her sister destroyed evidence of that in order to protect her after her death. Walt Disney enjoyed the Grimm Brother-esque fairy tales so much that he built a multi-billion empire on the retellings of these tales. Nintendo, another multi-billion-dollar corporation, took two very famous characters, Peter Pan and Lord of the Rings Legolas, to create their own character, the hero in The Legend of Zelda. I'm not referring to Zelda. But these works were all scripted screen, so to speak. There's not anybody outside of the industries who got to read or watch or play the stories before they were on the shelves. But that's the difference with fan fiction. Fan fiction is works of fiction by the fans for the fans. I'm gonna age myself a little bit here. I was actually writing fan fiction before AO3, which is archive of our own, before Wattpad, before fandom Tumblr was even concepted. I was writing fan fiction on fanfiction.net. Fanfiction. Yes.
Got you beat.
Oh yeah.
I've been writing fan fiction since before there was public internet.
Yes. Fanfiction.net, for those of you that do not know, actually got its conception in 1998, and you can still find stories on fanfiction.net today. Let's see. Even before I was on fanfiction.net, I was on some sort of silly forum for the Harvest Moon games. I was role-playing my favorite one in 2003, which is Friends of Mineral Town. Fun fact, for those of you that know Stardew Valley, concerned ape Eric Barone actually got his start role-playing as the doctor in Friends of Mineral Town. He role-played on some sort of like Minecraft server, so there's no chance I could have role-played with him, but I love that common thread between us. And then fan fiction, by the way, is kind of a sense of role-playing, even if you're just role-playing with yourself, because you are telling the story of characters and plots and whatnot that are not actually your own. It is continuing to write, or maybe even rewrite, somebody else's story in the way that you wanted it done, basically. It's maybe possibly putting somebody else's character in an alternate universe that you've created, or it is putting somebody else's plot in a completely different genre that you prefer. Fanfiction is a labor of love. It's something placed into the hands of fans as it's being written. It's not something that takes 2 to 10 years to put on the shelf. It's basically an instant gratification of sorts, but also a way to live forever in the stories that we love. And then there are fan fictions so loved by readers and writer alike that they end up being parsed back, the fandom characters pulled away and made into their own beings, the storyline peeled off and turned original, so that these stories can be posted on shelves instead of just screens and given their own fandoms entirely. That's when fan fiction becomes fiction. So I do have a few specific titles that I'm going to be mostly referring to today. I was about 11 or 12 myself when I started writing fan fiction. I didn't know then that my love of writing fan fiction could actually become a career for me. Back then, my dream had kind of been to voice in the kinds of cartoons that I was writing about. It wasn't until one specific story started kind of climbing the charts that I ever realized fan fiction could be turned into original stories. I just want to let everybody know I'm not speaking on my opinions of authors or plot lines or anything. It's not my place to tell anybody what y'all should read, what y'all should like. I'm just going to be stating facts. The fact of today's topic is that the fan fiction to fiction pipeline would not be what it is without Stephanie Meyer and her story Twilight. As I was doing my research, I was writing, down titles of the books, and I actually had to stop writing down titles that were inspired by Twilight because there were just too many of them. Twilight was probably not the first fandom to have its fanfiction become published original works, and it certainly won't be the last, but it could be one of the few that started the discussion today. There's a podcast called Fated Mates that is hosted by Sarah McLean and Jean Prokop. It does have multiple episodes on the topic of Twilight and the fan fiction that has come out of Twilight. I listened to bits of 2 episodes in particular where guests Christina Hobbs and Lauren Billing were brought on. These 2 are writers who write together under the name of Christina Lauren. They wrote Beautiful Bastard together. Originally titled The Office, the earliest date I could find for the now removed Twilight fanfiction is 2009. In 2013, Bella Swan became Chloe Mills and Edward Cullen became Bennett Ryan, a beautiful bastard. The Office, much like 90% of the Twilight fanfiction to fiction titles that I came across, is a contemporary romance genre. This means both Bella and Edward are basically just human within their universes. In their universe in The Office, Bella and Edward work together at an office. Bella is Edward's assistant that he falls hard for despite his rule against inter-office romances. He decides he's going to do whatever he can to have her and keep her all over the office. I pulled that off the back cover synopsis. So I've not read neither Beautiful Bastard nor its original fan fiction. I really did enjoy listening to Christina Lauren's Fated Mates episodes. You're gonna have to forgive me, I couldn't really parse whose voice is who on the podcast, so I will be referring to both of them as a whole unit, Christina Lauren. One of the most endearing moments of their first Fated Mates episode, if you want to look it up, it is season 3, episode 9. Christina Lauren explains how fic writers of Twilight usually have their own unique fandom names for their Edward Cullen character. Their character in their fanfiction was Blissword. They continue to explain who Blissword is as, a character to them, and mid description, one of them interrupts the other and goes, "Would you say he's a beautiful bastard?" But both episodes of Fated Mates featuring Christina Lauren start off with each half explaining how they came into the Twilight fandom and how they came across one another to start writing with each other and therefore becoming best friends. They did name a lot of the other writers who had their Twilight fanfiction published, whose original stories as their other associates and friends. A lot of the names that I myself had written down on my list. Both of each author's story is pretty similar. A family member recommended Twilight to them. Both writers, not quite writing at that time, were actually offended because to them Twilight is a story for teenagers, and they were not teenagers. They were both mothers at the time. According to a note that a random teenager left for one of the writers to find at her local Barnes & Noble, Twilight's featured vampires are just sparkly abominations. Christina Lauren's Twilight story isn't for teenagers. I need to say that straight up. It is an adult book. And that is the point that they kind of were hoping to make. A story belongs not only to the writer, but to the reader as well. It can become whatever the reader wants to make of it or even write of it. Fanfiction is the world in which readers can learn to be authors too. One half of the author team says she didn't even know how to properly use quotation marks when she first began to write. She would get comments on her fanfiction like, "What are these quotation marks?" Let's see. But basically they kind of address that fan fiction sets up the basis, pun intended, for the story, for readers like Christina Lauren to hit home as writers as well. From ages of 11 to 14 is when I wrote most of my fan fiction. Before that, I kind of just enjoyed writing for school, or I would have pen pals that I liked to write to, but it was my love of the characters that I ended up writing about that gave me my love of story writing. I kind of didn't really keep writing fan fiction because once I started coming up with my own characters, my own stories, I couldn't really stop. I'm not even sure I'll be able to write them all. And that's kind of the point of what Christina Lauren was trying to make as well. There are so many Twilight fanfiction, I don't even know if one person could read all of them. But everyone who has ever read Twilight fanfiction probably has one that they think of first when they think of the fanfiction to fiction pipeline. For most of them, it's more than likely not Christina Lauren's story. It is another contemporary romance set with a young woman and a businessman, probably a beautiful one, a gray one, or 50 Shades. E.L. James published her Twilight fanfiction, then titled Master of the Universe, under the username of Snow Queen's Ice Dragon. She got so many negative comments about the mature nature of the story that she felt forced to pull it off of whichever fanfiction website she was using. She created her own website for the fanfiction that was titled just50shades.com or something like that. And then she ended up rewriting her fanfiction entirely as her original story. 50 Shades of Grey and its two sequel novels were originally published through the Writers' Coffee House. It's the Writers' Coffee Shop. The Writers' Coffee Shop is, or it was, based in Australia because it no longer exists. It's easy enough to speculate why. The Writers' Coffee Shop published original works, including the rewritten Master of the Universe, but they also published fan fiction for money. Earning money for a completely fan-written story of somebody else's story crosses all kinds of copyright infringement laws. You don't want to do it. After going out of business, the Writers' Coffee Shop tried to pivot to become Star's Library, which is just an archive library for fan fiction only that was free. But even Star's Library is no longer active online. So they must have learned their lesson in trying to take money for somebody else's work. But 50 Shades of Grey was eventually picked up by the UK publisher Vintage Book, and they made it the worldwide bestseller that it is today. The American film studios Universal ended up picking it up as a film series. The production was fully American, but for the most part, all of the actors are English. And of course, it is one of the reasons why 50 Shades of Grey is the most commonly known Twilight fan fiction today. But we also probably have to credit the negativity that surrounded the mature nature of the story. There's this moment that I remember kind of right after the first film came out. I was visiting a local church with a family member, and the preacher was given this, passionate service about how the material of the world was seeping into the church and all of that. And for some reason, he told the story of how whenever you go to hotels, you would, usually find a Christian Bible in the nightstand or something. And according to him, they were removing the Bibles in favor of copies of 50 Shades of Grey. And I remembered this so well that every time I have been to a hotel since, I have checked for 50 Shades of Grey, and it's almost always the religious Christian Bible. There's one instance where instead of the Bible, it was the Book of Mormon, which is pretty ironic because Stephanie Meyer is famously Mormon.
Usually it's either the King James or Gideon's Bible.
Yes, correct. So, Stephanie Meyer, like I said, she's famous in Utah for being Mormon. She got her degree from BYU, which is the Mormon University, and she has, a high standing amongst the Latter-day Saints. So when she was once asked about 50 Shades of Grey, she stated simply that it isn't her genre because of her religion and the mature nature of the book. And in Christina Lauren's first Fated Mate episode, they admitted that though they bow at the feet of Stephanie Meyer, their wording, something I'm sure the Mormon Church doesn't exactly approve of, the Twilight author, in their opinion, did a disservice to Edward and Bella because of the way she treated their marriage in the end to focus mostly on her religion. The negativity for 50 Shades of Grey does come, of course, from the mature nature of the genre, but there is also another community that felt disserviced by the Twilight story. Beautiful Bastards and 50 Shades of Grey are both contemporary romance. I said that earlier, but there's one Twilight story that I came across in which Edward is not a normal mortal day human, as Bennett and Christian are. Transcendence by Savage7289, Ed spelled EHD, or Cave Word, as I saw jokingly on Good Word reads, is a caveman from, way back when there were actually cavemen. In the story, a woman who was originally Bella travels back in time to the days of the cavemen, and she ends up falling for Ed. Shay Savage, the author, ended up self-publishing her fanfiction as an original story under the same name of Transcendence. Goodreads lists it as a new adult novel, but a couple of the reviews that I read call it more or less an open door romance, so it might not be age appropriate either. Nearly every one of the reviews I read, though, speaks highly of Shay Savage's ability to create the romance between the two main characters when there is a language barrier. I chose to include the self-published title because, first of all, traditionally published does not always make for a better story. In many cases, it simply means that the author has better means. But my second reasoning is that it is one of the few fan fiction that is not under the contemporary romance genre. I wanted to note that it could be under, fan fiction could be under many genres. Reviews label it as science fiction, but it's more a historical romance. And then my final reasoning to add Transcendence to my list is due to the story itself being written entirely in the male point of view. Christina Lauren's first Fated Mates episode, they pointed out a few ways to tell when an author originally comes from fanfiction. Among stream of consciousness writing, a certain type of romance language created solely in fanfiction, they stated that writing in the male point of view is a pretty big tell. Thinking back on my fanfiction days of both writing and reading, many fics were written in the point of view of the love interest. Twilight is in Bella's point of view, but then later, several years later, Stephanie Meyers wrote Midnight Sun in Edward Cullen's point of view. There are a few other young adult authors that have done this. Jennifer L. Arment-Trout did it. Veronica Roth did it with her follow-up novel 4 in 4's point of view, Divergent. And basically, in writing in the love interest point of view, it's giving the reader what they want, to see as much in the minds of the love interest as we see in the main character. It's why a lot of fanfiction are written this way, because it gives them the freedom to do this. Fanfiction.net was founded 7 full years before Twilight was published. There are thousands of fandoms in the book category alone. There are over 200,000 Twilight fanfiction on just fanfiction.net. That's before counting AO3 or Wattpad or anywhere else you would find fanfiction. And that is how Twilight is the catalyst for fanfiction that has become original fiction. Twilight was published the same year as Star Wars Episode 3 premiered in theaters. Episode 3 being the conclusion to the Star Wars prequel trilogy and is famously memed amongst millennials everywhere. And of course, I was in theaters the day of that premiere. Surprisingly though, Amidala, that is Anakin, and Queen Amidala is not actually the starship amongst fanfiction. It's mostly, well, fanfiction to fiction. It's mostly Reylo, Rey and Kylo Ren. Episode 7 released 10 years after the end of the Star Wars prequel did. The number of books I had first written down on my Twilight list before I gave up is the number of Reylo books that I actually found all together. And we're going to be starting off strong with a fan fiction in which Kylo Ren is turned into a vampire. Y'all are going to love this. My roommate's a virgin vampire, with an apostrophe, by the way. Was initially released as a Reylo fiction on Twitter. Yes, Twitter. Before it was ever X. User ATGenononit, I don't know how to pronounce that, I'm sorry. She precursored her fiction with, "It's gonna be pure camp." And then she proceeded to post screenshots that she made up on her phone of emails and text chains to tell her story of Rey moving into a new place with a complete stranger, Ben. Rey eventually discovers that Ben moonlights as a vampire. As the story unfolds from there, my roommate's virgin vampire ended up being posted on AO3 as well, according to her Twitter thread, which you can still find today. Eventually, it was rewritten and published as just "My Roommate is a Vampire" by Jenna Levine. In Jenna Levine's Goodreads bio, it explains by day she has her day job, but by night she's a novelist, as if she might be the vampire too. There is one author other than Jenna Levine who holds a full 40% of the Reylo fanfiction to fiction list. That's Ali Hazelwood. She blew up on the book talk scene a few years ago. I really can't even walk into a bookstore to this day without finding her novels front and center on every hashtag book talk shelf. Whenever I do, the same book is usually front and center of that shelf, and that is The Love Hypothesis. I look at the cartoon couple on the cover of The Love Hypothesis, and it really just screams Rey and Kylo Ren, almost as if the artists used actual renderings of Daisy Ridley and Adam Driver, which according to the wiki, that's kind of exactly what they did. The Love Hypothesis was originally posted on AO3 as a Reylo fic titled Head Over Feet by Ever So Reylo. Head Over Feet is described as a college AU, that's alternate universe, fanfiction, wherein Rey just keeps kissing Ben out of nowhere to avoid Hux making advances at her. That description is pulled straight from a reader of the fiction. The fiction, it seems, was originally dedicated to one Marco Amizm, who was thanked for the awesome prompt. In greater detail, Head Over Feet is a fic where Rey plays the part of a grad student and Ben plays the part of her professor. It's basically a grown-up To All the Boys I've Loved Before, with the added moral questions of a professor-student romance. In To All the Boys I've Loved Before, which is a young adult contemporary original romance by Jenny Han, Lara Jean Covey ends up in a fake relationship in order to convince her sister's ex-boyfriend that she is not in love with the dude. And Ali Hazelwood's The The Love Hypothesis, Olive Smith, originally Rey, ends up in a fake relationship to convince her best friend that she isn't in love with her own ex, who is the best friend's current boyfriend. To All the Boys I've Loved Before is set in high school, and The Love Hypothesis is set in a college. Of course, To All the Boys I've Loved Before isn't the first, nor will it be the last fake novel, but I felt that it really fit with the Reylo fanfiction to fiction list. It's not, and then The Love Hypothesis, is not even the only fake dating romance on the Reylo list. The Fake Mate by Lana Ferguson also holds the honor. The Love Hypothesis also isn't even Ali Hazelwood's only Reylo-inspired original novel. She has an entire series of novellas on the Reylo fanfiction to fiction list that she calls her STEMinist novels. That's STEM, science, technology, engineering, mathematics, and feminist. Not only is Ali Hazelwood a fan of Star Wars, the entire franchise based on science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, but she's actually a neuroscience professor. It all goes back to Christina Lauren's hypothesis, pun intended, that fanfiction teaches fans of all working or schooling backgrounds how to become a writer. Of course, in Ali Hazelwood's schooling, she would have written paper after paper after paper, and she probably wrote research papers in her job as well. But it was something she was able to turn into what she actually really loved to do, which is story writing. First somebody else's story, and then her own story. All of Ali Hazelwood's novellas in her STEMinist series depict cartoons of Reylo more or less as the covers. 40% of as she covers 40% of the Reylo fanfiction to fiction list, it is no surprise that all of the other fanfiction on the list seem to depict the same type of cover, all but one. The Hurricane Wars by Thea Guanzon depicts a very fantasy-esque cover. Just think of, young adult fantasy novels. That's the cover. The only one on the list that I would actually feel like fits the Star Wars franchise being a fantasy, it is the only fantasy. With kind of the exception of the paranormal, my roommate is a vampire, the rest of the list is all contemporary romance as well. This is very, pipeline of fan fiction to romance mentioned in the Fated Mates podcast. See, the original fan fiction was Landscape with a Blur of Conquerors. It featured a marriage of convenience between Force-crossed lovers Rey and Kylo Ren, orchestrated by Snake. For reasons that I can only be assumed to be towards, kind of ending the wars that were going on in the Star Wars universe. In the fan fiction, Thea Guanzon features a niche corner of the Star Wars universe that is not as known as the actual movies. The Hapes Cluster, which is featured only in the novel The Courtship of Princess Leia. This novel actually belongs to the Star Wars franchise. Thea Guanzon's Rey is the long-lost heir of the Hapes Cluster, used in the marriage to unite the Hapes and the Empire. In rewriting her fiction into an original story, Thea Guanzon created her own warring factions. Taliesin, who is Rey, fights alongside the Sardovian Alford, while Alaric, who's Kylo Ren, fights for the Knight Emperor of Kassath. They are very Star Wars-esque names. The author didn't stray too far from the Star Wars franchise. There does seem to be even more connections to the Star Wars franchise than just the names. It feels very fan fiction to read it, as 50 Shades of Grey feels very Twilight fan fiction to read. The final book in the trilogy has not come out yet, but according to readers on fan fiction, the original fan fiction does not feature happily ever after. They hope that the trilogy will. Hurricane Wars was published only 2 years ago, and the conclusion should come out later this year in 2026. So I suppose only time will tell on its ending and how Star Wars-esque stories might remain. On fiction.net, fanfiction.net, There are thousands of fandoms under categories such as books, movies, video games, etc., etc. There's also a miscellaneous category which includes things like mythology. By the time fandom Tumblr and Wattpad came around, fans were writing fan fiction about their favorite celebrities. There is a genre of original stories called real people fiction, in which characters are inspired by real people. There is an infamous title inspired by Adam Driver, who is the real-life Kylo Ren. However, when I was deep in the throes of fandom Tumblr, I remember that these stories used to be called Y/N, which is just your name. Your Name is a story in which you are the protagonist and your favorite person is the love interest. A lot of writers will write YN about themselves, but they can also do commissions wherein they'll write about you. Because you cannot copyright a real life person, you can be paid to write fan fiction about real life people wherein you insert somebody else as the love interest. They don't they don't cross the copyright infringement laws. And even though I probably did not pay for it, I do remember that I might have a Y/N floating around on Tumblr from when I was 19 about One Direction. Yes.
I will say one thing there with the YN fiction is that you have to be a little bit careful there.
You do.
You might cross the line into libel slander laws.
Definitely, that is true. I will agree with that. So this is when I actually know what I'm talking about, because back in the day, I knew everything that could be known about One Direction. I could tell you their middle names. I could tell you where they were born and when. I knew that Liam Payne, rest in peace, once refused to use spoons because of PTSD from when he went to primary school. I have even read parts of the most famous or infamous, if you want to look at it like that, YN from the early years of One Direction. I didn't read the entirety of after Anna Todd's famous fanfiction to fiction. I didn't quite like the whole trope that she was going with. But I also know that I'm not exactly the only directioner who felt that way. A lot of people felt like they were kind of interfering in on Harry Styles' life by reading this fan fiction. But I also know that it went the other way. After would not have been published as an original novel less than 2 years after its Wattpad release if it didn't have fans. There would not be 5 film series inspired by the book if it wasn't a loved book. And Anna Todd would not have made an entire career out of being a One Direction fan if she didn't have a fandom of her own. It's been over a decade now since she first released After, so I couldn't tell you much about what I read. I just went in on the wiki and the summary, and I read that in doing, research on this. Somehow, I didn't even remember that Anna Todd's protagonist has a name first and last, exactly 1 letter off from my original protagonist's name. Anna Todd didn't use her own name in her Your Name. But I do feel like I've read the entire story just from Wikipedia's plot summary. After is said to echo the troubling dynamics of 50 Shades of Grey. They were both fanfiction first. They both featured a very toxic love interest. And After seems to be nothing more than a will they, won't they love story. Though it seems like it might feature a happily ever after. In Anna Todd's original fiction, Harry Styles becomes Hardin Scott. Landon is Hardin's soon-to-be stepbrother and Liam Payne. Zed is obviously Zayn Malik. Zed is also, by the way, how One Direction would pronounce the letter Z in their accent. It seems that Niall Horan and Louis Tomlinson's characters are so on the side, they're not even listed on the wiki page. I guess we know which 2 aren't Anna Todd's favorites. Anna Todd wasn't even 26 when her fanfiction became an originally published fiction. I believe this makes her the youngest author on my list who found her success with an original fanfiction. She was just a young 20-something writing for fun about a band she loved. Now, she is 36 and she owns her own production company and imprint in partnership with Wattpad. She's still writing. In 2018, she published a modern-day Little Women retelling. It's nice to know that she's not let anybody's opinions on her story after stop her from writing stories inspired by other stories. I think everybody should get to do what they love. A lot of stories on my list are just as hated as they are loved, and we cannot deny some of the author's handship in this. It is said a lot online that E.L. James misrepresented an entire community, and Anna Todd has probably misled many young fans into believing that a love interest like hers is the correct type of love interest to go for. I'm sure that I can name any one author, both of fanfiction and original fiction, and point out any fatal flaws. I could probably point out fatal flaws of my own. But sometimes we do have to wonder when it is time to separate the art from the artist. So now I'm going to talk about one of the few fanfiction that I've actually read. I read it as the original fiction itself. After I was done writing fiction for a while, I was still on fanfiction.net reading other people's fanfictions. And I did not read this author's fanfiction. I did read the entire series that came of it. I'm not going to reveal the author's name. I'm not going to reveal the book's titles. I'm not going to reveal the fandom that she wrote of or her ship. Because sometimes you really can't separate the art from the artist, especially when it isn't even her own art. Looking back at my own fanfiction.net account, it says my story dates back to the month of my 13th birthday in 2006, which is several months after the completion of the show that I was writing about, even though I know I was writing previously to that. Throughout the years that I was writing, we didn't have internet at home, so we would go to my local library, and that was where I would upload my fanfiction after writing them on my home computer. So we were going to the library about once or twice a week. My dad took my sister and I will actually never forget the day that my sister ran up to the computer I was reading fanfiction on, and she took control of the mouse. She led it to a specific page on fanfiction.net, and it was a fiction that she had found with a description that sounded a little too familiar, a title that hit a little too close to home. You might know where I'm going with this because my fanfiction, the very first one that I ever wrote on fanfiction.net, was actually stolen by another writer. They didn't put much effort into making the story read as their own. They didn't change the title. They added a word here or there into the title. They hardly touched the description, and the story itself had so few pages they might as well have just hit copy-paste. Both myself and my sister obviously reported the fiction and a second that was also stolen by them. Both were taken down by the next time we were at the library. It might have only been fan fiction, and I might have only been blossoming into teenagehood, but I had had my first taste of plagiarism. Plagiarism can appear in any art form: song, lyrics, fiction, fan fiction. We see it every day now in AI. In the early 2000s, it happened to me. It happened because of another fanfiction.net writer. But it didn't happen just because of the one that was stolen from me, but one who would become a best-selling author by the early 2010s. For the purpose of today's topic, I'm going to call this author JR henceforth. JR posted a she posted her story on fanfiction.net over the course of 6 years. From what I've read up on, it was actually a trilogy. It was gobbled up by her, so to speak, fangirls. I guess that's how it kind of became such a scandal. She had so many fans. One fan said something, one former fan said something, and the dominoes fell, as it were. JR posted the finale of her fic the same month that my first fic was said to be posted on fanfiction.net. That's a coincidence, but it was also posted the same day as the expose that revealed the evidence of her plagiarism. It might just be another coincidence. The evidence exposed whole paragraphs in JR's fic that was taken from a no longer in print novel with changes only to the characters' names. The paragraphs were exposed side by side. There's no denying it. It was stolen. There were also quotes all throughout JR's fic trilogy taken from various popular shows. There was no citation to these quotes. And then there came a point where readers were actually playing games to see which quote came from which show or movie or book, etc. Some readers didn't quite see it as plagiarism, being that it's just fan fiction. But fanfiction.net definitely did see it as plagiarism. They banned JR completely from the website 6 weeks after the finale of her fanfiction trilogy. But it didn't end there. Not only did JR move to another fic website for a whole new story and a whole new fandom, but she'd already had a contract for originally publishing a trilogy of her own. This was before she was banned from fanfiction.net. The trilogy ended up doubling in size to 6 books. It earned a prequel series and a follow-up series. I had found out about the ordeal just after the first book of the follow-up series came out, and I did not even finish the first book of the follow-up series. I did, however, read the entirety of both of the previous series, more than once. I'm not sure how much this author's franchise has grown since then. I do know that she had 2 on-screen adaptations that both ended up failing. It could have been that the box office only profited about 30% of the original budget of the movie. It could have been that the show's declining viewership and profit loss of the second season could not afford a third one. Or it could have been that the news came out around the same time that the second season was finishing up. There was another author suing JR over alleged copyright infringement. I have to say alleged. The lawsuit never saw completion. It was stated that the 2 authors settled things outside of court. Basically, it came out that the claiming author was being more or less forced by her husband to file the claim in the first place, and she ended up divorcing the man. Basically, all of this means that we will never see any real evidence of the alleged plagiarism, but it kind of says enough from the evidence that we do have from her fanfiction plagiarism. It certainly says enough that full pieces of her fanfiction made it into her original fiction, so we cannot state that that was not stolen either. And it says enough to me that once the news came out and I did pick up one of the novels alleged to be taken from, that it actually felt like I was reading JR's original novels, 1-to-1. One word is the difference between the clan that JR's character belongs to and the clan that the other author's characters belong to. From here on out, I will be calling the other author KM. KM's characters were alleged to be taken from. One of the characters in KM's novels dies pretty early on. JR also tried to kill a character off early on. It was very obvious that these 2 characters were inspired by one another. And he was a well-loved character of JR's. JR's editor basically said, no, not happening. And it could very well be the only reason that JR was forced to create this character out of original concept. I'm sure we'll never really know because the concept of a character cannot be copyrighted, not even if the hero of her fan fictions were blatantly rewritten as the hero of her fictions. I loved JR's characters long before the copyright case was filed. There was like this contest and correlation to the show, and I wrote a letter to my favorite character of JR's. The actress who played her role in the show adaptation ended up reading and reposting my letter on her social media. And then a couple of years later, I ended up meeting KM at a local Comic-Con over in Mobile, Alabama. And I remember telling her how much I loved her original character, the one that inspired JR's character that I had written the letter to. There was also a Q&A that KM did at the con. She briefly mentioned her case when a reader asked about it, but she did state that it was a fan of hers that had come to let her know about the other stories. She'd never heard of the books previously to meeting that fan, which is almost funny because it's basically the same thing that JR says about every story she's allegedly taken from. When she was first approached about pulling full paragraphs from the no longer in print book that was featured in her fanfiction. She had said that she found it written in her own handwriting in an old journal of hers, and she thought it original work. JR defends herself at every turn against both allegations and evidence, and she kind of bullies anybody, reader or otherwise, who tries to bring this evidence to light. She is pretty unkind, and for me, it almost wouldn't matter even if JR didn't take concepts from KM's story. Her treatment of her former and her current friends, fans alike, is enough to keep me from separating the artist from the art. This is an artist who broke my reader heart. I did have to separate myself from her, and I kept only one of her books that I couldn't stand to part with. But I am an artist who tries her very best to never break any hearts, any other than my own, that is, as I try to break out into the authoring world. My very first fan fiction was fittingly called How It All Started. How It All Started is a one-shot fluff, which is basically a singular chapter. Fluff is just like really, really cute and sweet. How It All Started tells the story of my chosen ship coincidentally meeting one another before their story actually started. In a way, it's how my story started too. My story didn't start here with my self-published original story. It started in the Xiaolin Showdown fandom with the Raymundo and Kimiko ship. So Xiaolin Showdown has 4.5 thousand stories on fanfiction.net alone. Some are actually still being updated today, which is great because the show's like 20 plus years old. It's something of a pretty niche fandom. Xiaolin Showdown was a cartoon that first premiered when WB Kids was still a thing in 2001. It was created by Christy Wee, and it stars voices the likes of Tara Strong, Tom Kenny, and Jason Marsden. It is, at its core, a cartoon about the four core elements: water, wind, fire, earth. A war ended 1,500 years before is brought back to life when an evil boy genius, that's what he calls himself, frees a ghost witch from a simple wooden puzzle box. The victors of the war will be the side that obtains the most Shengangwu, magical artifacts that are hidden around the world. Many fic writers of Xiaolin Showdown create their own Shengangwu. There was a contest once when the show was still airing to create your own Shengangwu, and I actually ended up winning that one as a runner-up. My original story does not feature, this one right here, does not feature my original Shengangwu. Was some sort of crystal, if I remember it correctly. I don't remember what it did. But I did stop writing Xiaolin Showdown fan fiction when I was 15 or 16. I didn't even pick up a pen after that for a few years. When I did pick my pen back up, I started turning my longest fan fiction of Xiaolin Showdown into my own original story. That fan fiction is titled Yin's Revenge. I don't remember if I had renamed the original story right after Yin's Revenge up until its current publication. It might have just been Yin's Revenge for a while. I don't really remember anything at all about my first draft because I was 18 years old when I first started it. I was basically still a kid. I was still so naive that I kind of didn't realize the harm of a vanity publisher approaching me and telling me that my original story could be a bestseller. A traditional publisher never would have read my book after the first chapter of the first draft, because everybody knows that the first draft of a book does not actually make a book. Everybody but me, apparently, at the age of 18. It's been 15 years now since that first draft, and I can't even count how many drafts it's been since that first one. I could only say that it's been so many that Xiaolin Showdown cannot possibly exist in it any longer. The ship of Raymundo and Kimiko could not possibly exist in it any longer. Raymundo is the snarky, sarcastic dragon of the wind in training who becomes the hero when nobody else believes in him. Kimiko is one of only 3 female characters featured in Xiaolin Showdown, the only one not on the villainous side. She is the Xiaolin Dragon of Fire, and she was my hero when I was 11. But I didn't write Kimiko into this original story here. I didn't write the hero that I looked up to when I was a kid. I wrote a kid who could one day grow up to be a hero. I wrote a character full of anxiety, fear, full of fight. I didn't write Raymundo into my original story. I wrote a soft boy who learns how to hold a girl's spear in his gentle hands. I didn't write Omi, one of the other main featured characters into my original story. I wrote a sassy, somewhat, sexy girl, the only one who could possibly be my protagonist's best friend. I will admit, the fourth character, Clay, has the most inspiration out of anybody else, but that's only because he's from my home state. I had to feature a character like that. But I didn't take any inspiration from any of Xiaolin Showdown's villains. My villains are entirely my own. The core of my story is entirely my own. Only the core of the 4 elements of fire, air, water, and earth remain. I never really wanted anybody to pick up my novels and know that they already read it 20 years ago, especially since 20 years ago I was 12 years old. And I think that's okay. I'm not the same person I was back then. I'm also not E.L. James. I'm not Anna Todd or even C.C. Nessa, my protagonist in my original story, is less part Kimiko now and more parts me. And parts of Nessa's story will always belong to parts of my story, because fan fiction doesn't just continue stories, it creates them. In the world that we live in now that sometimes feels like it actually could be fiction, we need these stories more than ever. It's just as Chris Colfer said in his own original fiction, there is nothing stranger than fan fiction.
As of today, I have hosted my panel at both SACC and Pensacon, both well received. I also hope to host my panel at Mississippi Comic Con sometime. Since the hosting of the first panel, it has come to my attention that there are people online who try and commission fan fiction, as in they write a fan fiction for somebody else's fandom, and they make money off of it. Again, I would like to state how illegal this is and how it crosses copyright infringement. It isn't just illegal, but it is also dangerous to the fan fiction community. There are people who are trying to get fan fiction as a whole removed from the internet and as a whole crossing copyright infringement due to people who are commissioning and selling their fan fiction. Again, I would just like to add one final spoiler alert. Do not do this. And do not come into my community, please, if you do this or if you support this in any way whatsoever, because I do not support this. But if you do support fan fiction writers who create their own original content and become fiction writers because of it, in my description, my duologies are linked, and so is my fanfiction.net account from 20 years ago.